I firstly thank Farouk for giving me this opportunity to...
Let me just switch it on. Okay, we're running now.
Okay. Can I firstly thank Farouk here in the Hason Radio Centre on the 12th of August for giving this opportunity to give a talk. I don't think of it as a lecture, and particularly in light of the fact that we're a few days away from when Pakistanis will be celebrating independence on the 14th and the Indians' independence on the 15th. I'm particularly focused on the Sylhetis. I am a descendant of a Sylheti family from Sylhet town, so I've got a perspective on this which hopefully you'll appreciate. And I think there's a particular bit of history just before partition proper, which involved a referendum. And that referendum, I would like to suggest, is almost like our own Brexit. This is something which not too many people know about, but I think it's important that we go back to it fairly regularly, because I think it's a critical bit of the history of the Bangladeshis here in the UK. Firstly, yes, as I was just saying, next week, I know when I used to be an assembly member at City Hall, I would be invited by the Pakistanis and Indians to celebrate independence. But I was always struck that the Bangladeshis never did this. And yet, as Farouk will tell you very clearly, we were probably the most affected by British colonial rule for several hundred years. First contact they had with the subcontinent was with Bengal. The main battles were there before they made and once they made the inroads there, they expanded further into the rest of the subcontinent. So there is a particular history, I think, which I grew up with, and I always wondered about this. And this is an attempt to address this, because I think it needs to be addressed. We should be celebrating it, because the reality is this was also, if this didn't happen, I don't think the Liberation of Bangladesh would happen in 1971 as well. But I'll expand on that later. Why cover it at all, this period? Well, there's three, I touched on one. It's the Sylheti story, which I think is untold in the UK. I've heard it through word of mouth, but I think we've all heard it through our families. And I think we need to bring that out of our family histories. The story of partition, I think, is overshadowed. For example, I think there's we'll see it next week. I think, dare I say, the emphasis will be on the Punjab and not on Bengal. I think things happen there which have been forgotten, like this story that I'm going to tell you. And the Sylheti story is untold. And like some of us have been privy to it, I'm grateful. I have heard it, but not everyone has. But even within our community as well, the community of the predominant make-up of the Bangladeshi community. Partition referendum. This event actually happened literally a month before partition rules. There was a provision within the Independence Act which allowed for referendums. And thankfully, I think we should be grateful that in some ways it was utilised in this context. But in doing this, I'm going to go through what the public poll involved, why the poll, memories from the grave, build up to the poll, the result, and then Independence Day and aftermath. I think that's the best way of breaking it down. But legally, if you look at the 1946 Independence Act, which Parliament passed, allowed this provision, and it was used in this case for Thank you. And it happened very rapidly. Firstly, the point I wanted to make. It was declared on the 3rd of July and literally undertaken within 4 or 5 days. And it simply said, should Sylhet join East Bengal? There was actually no reference to Pakistan, but it was quite clear that's what was being proposed. This does have implications. Bengali Hindus have historically said, well, actually, it fooled a lot of people into thinking it was something else. But that's That's one of the issues we'll go into a bit later on. But the key to it was, at the time, Sylhet was actually part of Assam, not part of Bengal. It's always moved between Assam and Bengal. It's always had this move, it's moved between those two administrative entities in the British Raj. And there was if you remember, if you know your Bengali history as well, at the beginning of the last century, Bengal was divided and reunited again in 1905 and then 1915? 1911, yes, you're right. And the thrust of it wasn't coming from actually Muslim Bengalis or Muslim Sylhetis. It actually came from the Assamese. There was a big hang-up about this particular bit of Assam having a Muslim majority and a predominantly Hindu province. For example, I've heard stories from my dada about how he used to work in Shillong and they ran the whole of Assam. And I think that must have built in resentment. My father was actually born in Shillong. So it shows, I think, what the Bengali Muslim Sylheti elite were doing. They were moving around a lot more than I think people frankly realised. They weren't necessarily, Dhaka wasn't seen as the centre, they went to Assam. They went to Ceylon because that's where the jobs were, and in a similar vein to what you have in Dhaka now. And then also, the cause was, interestingly enough, adopted by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the father of the state of Pakistan. And he incorporated it within his demands for the 6 provinces that should make up Pakistan. It came very late in the day, but it meant they sent people out to campaign for the inclusion, for Sylhetis to opt for East Bengal. Now, memories from the grave. I'm referring to, there are 1 or 2 references I should refer you to. This is a book my father wrote before he passed away, thankfully. And many stories I will tell you come from there. And there are other people around. I was trying to get Sawal Aziz. He's another contemporary of my father. He came to this country at much the same time in the late 50s, but he's not very well. And unfortunately, you're not going to hear the verbal history directly, you're going to hear it secondhand from myself. So for example, my father gives insights in his book, things like during the campaign, the Muslim League did send a lot of people up, and they were more focused than the Congress Party on this referendum. And they were putting slogans around like hit the house with the axe. The axe was the symbol the Muslim League were using, and the house was the symbol the Congress was using. And that sounds to me very communal, and it isn't really helpful. But if you read Sawal Aziz Ramsas's book, he will tell you that his father stood with the Congress Party against going to East Bengal, but stayed in India. So that, it wasn't necessarily completely, loyalties weren't completely based religiously, is what I'm trying to convey. And you will get that very clearly if you look at different, people's recollection of what happened in 47. And many of them, my dad was, for example, a teenager. So he saw it firsthand. And it was actually quite a turbulent time. We just had the Bengal famine in 43. In all their living memories, one of the recollections he can give you is how the starving all came into Sylhet town in huge numbers they'd never seen before. And they were busy putting soup kitchens together, which we're still doing actually. When we hear of a flood, what do we all do? We send money to the relatives to set up soup kitchens, and inshallah, it does help. It was also at the end of the Second World War. The Second World War had a particular impact in Sylhet, which we shouldn't forget. The Japanese were very near. If the Japanese encroached into India, into the British Raj's stuff, it would have been violent. I'll show the maps. I will show later which illustrate that. And also, there's obviously the campaign to quit India, which many people are focused. We've had World War II just come to an end. Actually, most did expect Attlee to win that election. They thought Churchill would be there. And my dad, for example, said, well, his view is that we would have to fight for it because Churchill made it abundantly clear that he wasn't trying to liberate the imperial subjects. His focus was actually to hold on to the imperial assets that the British state had at the time. Obviously, quite a different story with Attlee's government, and quite honestly, they had so much on. They wanted this moved on, and they did. They just handed it over to Mountbatten. That's another story. I show you this photograph just for the history. Jinnah actually made an effort. He actually went to Sylhet as a Muslim League representative and got in with the major Muslim League entities. That's clearly, obviously he's in the middle. These are probably the leading lights of the Muslim leaders in Sylhet at the time before this partition. There's only one person, I think anyone here may recognise apart from Muhammad Jinnah. I'll just point you to him. This long, tall fella here, who in subsequent years found himself here in the UK doing a lot of, I think, good work for the Bangladeshis, certainly in the East End. If you can remember his name right now, I'll give you a nice present. But that shows that I think some of the politics that was happening around there at that time. Jinnah made an effort, he incorporated it into his Sixth Province campaign for Pakistan, and this is actually in a tea plantation. He didn't actually go to Sylhet town, but he was got up in a tea plantation owner's place. So it was important to the Muslim League to win this referendum. I think there's a clear message from that. And people have got these photos, so I've got this from our family archive, and I'm sure there are plenty of other things like this around. The results, I tell you, it happened very rapidly. 3rd of July, we were told, 6th or 7th of July it happened. 57.43 percentages in favour of Sylhet joining East Bengal. This is a critical thing, 22% invalid ballots. You've got to remember, for a lot of people, this was the first time they put across anything. Because the British hadn't allowed them to put their votes to anything. That may explain that high percentage. And that 22% clearly would affect the percentages. But nonetheless, that's on the record. Actually, most of this information I'm telling you about, you don't have to go over there to find it. You can go to the British Library here in Camden and get most of it. Because most of the records, certainly from the British Raj side, are all there. I'm trying to intellectualise this, but this is the first time, I think, where you could vote to opt in and out of the country in the subcontinent. I actually think this option of a referendum should have been used in Kashmir. If it had been used in Kashmir, maybe we would have agreed with it. Because it's almost certain Kashmiris would not have voted in line with what is it the king or the Maharaja at the time opted for. They would probably have opted for Pakistan and not be a major issue of contention. But anyway, that I think is worth noting. And interestingly enough, this has implications subsequently in India actually. Let's move on. So that's the results.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So you know that because you had Sylhet.
Can I have your name, please?
That's not cool. And you've got Sylhet, but Assam is kind of also part of Assam.
Yeah.
And you've got parts of like Karimgunj and so on.
Yeah.
And so that part that got to be part of East Bengal, was it now considered modernism, or did it include?
I'll show you the maps. I'll show you. I think I know where you're going. And actually, the process of drawing the boundaries was an issue, and that comes into it. Stop moving again. Is that something? Okay. Now this is the breakdown of the figures. And I give you these because I think it's interesting. It wasn't. I gave you the overall results. Within Sylhet, there's a number of sub-districts. So, for example, the ones that we will be most familiar with here are Molibuzzer. I mean, for example, most of the Bangladeshis in Camden all come from Molibuzzer. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's correct.
Shinamganj, where are most people here? You're here.
It's 50-50, so 50% are from Shinamganj here.
Okay. Hobbygonj and Karimgonj I will come to, because but the interesting thing, the reason why I bring these figures out, the breakdowns, is it tells you the total votes, but it also tells you how many votes were cast in favour and votes cast against. The two I want to illustrate to you is Molibuzzer. Interesting enough, they voted to stay in Assam, that sub-district. I'll show you the map which it shows. And then Karimgonj actually voted to stay in, to be in East Bengal. Only marginally, but nonetheless, they wanted to stay in there. And I'll show you what happened to them. So I've shown you that one already. You had the referendum on the 6th or 7th July. The very next month, you had independence on the 14th and 15th of August. But the reality is actually at the time, this story is I find staggering. Actually, most people didn't know where the boundaries were for Pakistan, so and subsequently India, of course, as well. Actually, people got told the boundaries 2 days after independence. I had heard that story from my other conversations and what have you. It was confirmed last year when they did a programme on Mountbatten. Mountbatten made a point of keeping the boundaries to himself locked up because he thought it would help. I would like to suggest that caused no end of chaos. No one knew which side of the fence they were on. They were, for example, in my family was part of Sylhet town. There were many Hindu families that decided, well, we'd better be on the Indian side. But they weren't sure where the line was drawn and where we was. I mean, Sylhet town itself is about 60 miles from the border. That's actually not very far and significant. So, at independence, the Radcliffe line drawn by this anonymous bureaucrat who was sent to India to sort this out in 6 weeks, solely on the basis of religion, not on ethnic or physical geography of the locations at all, made its impact. But the other thing which was interesting, which I just touched on, one of the sub-districts of Sylhet, which had voted to go into East Bengal, was left still in India. And I suspect you know the story, the Karimgonj story. You don't? Okay. Well, that's where the facts come in and the boundaries. And I'll show you further. And then there was also an issue then, and it's still today, unfortunately, about Assami migrants, the movement. Like I said, the boundaries were left very unclear. We were only told this then 2 days after independence, and I think it had a substantial impact on the conflicts, particularly in Punjab. Less so in Bengal, but nonetheless it did have an impact. And Assami migrants coming into East Bengal was established as an issue then, and unfortunately still is, which I'll come back to when I sum up. That's the map that was drawn for Bengal. The red line was actually what eventually happened. The red line.
Do we know why Sri Lanka was?
Okay, that is a still district. Here's Sylhet, this is kind of the arm of Bangladesh. It was there, Assam. Like I showed you with the figures, the whole district had voted to go to East Bengal, including this bit here, Karimganj, that was left out, as you can see here. But that wasn't just a case of Karimganj. There were other kind of anomalies. The two that I would highlight, Khulna was meant to be in West Bengal, but was dropped. You can see the blue line was the Radcliffe line, basically. Khulna district, which is now in Bangladesh, should have been in West Bengal, according to the Radcliffe conclusion. And the Chittagong hill tracks were included when it hadn't really come up at all. That's an issue. So there was a lots of last minute hokey pokey and what have you. I mean, I go back to the Mountbatten film last year. They did suggest that people like Nehru had privy to these boundaries before anyone else, and there was some. Yeah, I won't go into any further than that. I don't really want to go any further than that. But I mean, there's no doubt Muhammad Ali Jinnah wasn't part of that setup and crew to influence these last bits and pieces being included. That's what I'll say. But that's the eventual map boundaries of East Bengal, East Pakistan at this point in time. Karimganj, the region which I just want to emphasise, literally, it's on the other side of the Bangladesh border. It's in what's the Indian state again? It's not Assam. It still is Assam. Sorry, But so there you are. It's right banks, mate. There's no one actually has given a definitive explanation of what happened. My only explanation is that it shows the incompetence of the British Raj at that time. No one, I would suggest, at the Indian office in Whitechapel was keeping an eye on what the hell Mountbatten was up to. No one. And that includes the Labour administration. The only thing I would defend them is that they had so much else on. This was the last thing on their plate. They just wanted this all dealt with, and they thought they'd handed it over to someone half competent. In today's world, that's Sylhet. Sorry, it's a bit hazy, but that's the four sub-districts. I hear increasingly, actually, people refer to themselves as from Holibaza, Holiganj, or Shulamganj. Because I think about 10, 15 years ago, people would have just said Sylhet. Now you will hear those sub-district names used more often. And in relationship to the modern map between India and Bangladesh in the northeast of India, the red bit is where Karimganj would be. But I'm sure you've heard of the recent trouble in Manipur, and that just shows how near it is. For the Indians, this is significant because it's actually the most vulnerable bits of the whole of the Indian Federation, honestly. The security envelope here is not what they have in other places. And I think I've earlier told you that actually the Japanese have made huge inroads here during the Second World War. I mean, they were literally up to the border of what is now Bangladesh. There are other issues around apart from issues to do from Assam, but also Manipur, and the Indians do keep a focus. Security-wise, need to keep the focus on this end of India. Can I just illustrate another example? That's something else which the British Raj wasn't particularly good at. Up until recently, it was a few years ago, we had all these enclaves. There were bits, would you believe it, bits of Bangladesh, Pakistan within India, then Bangladesh. and vice versa. And it's a bit like, I don't know, you buy a house now today and find there's 2 bits in your back garden which are owned by the next door neighbour. And the lawyer should have sorted that out at completion, but never was. Now that issue literally has been hanging around. Was hanging around up until a few years ago. It's the only half decent thing I think that's been done between the Modi government and Sheikh Hasina's government. They've actually sorted this out. The enclaves have been swapped. So people, for example, if you were a Bangladeshi in one of those enclaves, it's near impossible to get out of the enclave because you need Indian permission to get to another part of Bangladesh and vice versa. So those anomalies have been sorted out. But I only highlight this here to show to you what I think shows high-level incompetence by the British Raj. And I think I'm being very nice about it. I'm sure there were others, people in those enclaves who are up in arms about it, but because there's just small elements in a sea of people, predominantly they haven't been heard. But like I said, if you compare it to a lawyer today transacting a new land, someone buying a new piece of land, that would be considered way out of order, and I can't see why it wasn't dealt with at the time by the British Raj under Mountbatten. He was still you've got to remember, Mountbatten was still sticking around for another 6 or 8 months, because he had to wait several, I think, when Burma was independent in, I think, the following year, 48. So he was around for another 6 months. So there's no need really to rush it. Yes, I think I'm not saying we didn't want independence, but these kind of things, there was time to sort these things out, and they clearly weren't getting their head around these things. And they did cause no end of grief subsequently. I mentioned the Assami migrants. That recently came up again in a few years' time. Many of them are being denied their rights as Indian citizens. Well, they're not being recognised as Indians at all. And as a result, they're not even on the Assam draft list of citizens. I would suggest this is a hang-up of what was happening in 47 and still around. In some ways, we should be thankful for those of us on the Sylhet bit which opted into East Bengal. We haven't had those issues. But, yeah, whenever you hear things, that's the context. This was an issue in 47, it still is now, and there's no doubt there's an attempt to, what's the word? Take people who've been there for generations rights away from them if they don't have the adequate paperwork. And those Assamese elite have always been behind this job. Because you've got to remember, it wasn't the Bengali Muslims of Sylhet that pushed for this. It was the Assamese elite who were keen on this referendum. And got it. So, in conclusion, I think that the poll, whatever misgivings I have, I told you how quickly it was done, not very much discourse, but at least incorporated Sylhet into East Bengal, Pakistan. As I've suggested, the actual borders and enclaves, actual borders, Karimganj, how the hell is that outside? It should legitimately should have been in Pakistan, East Bengal, Pakistan then, and subsequently Bangladesh. I've told you about the enclaves. Another instance where I think the British Raj, and under Mountbatten, doesn't look very good at all. I also pose the question, is Bangladesh going to get the Assami refugees? And that is the suggestion being made by Indians in the campaign in Assam. They should be pushed back onto the other side of the border. I'm not sure how that can be ever accommodated, particularly when I think Bangladesh has already accommodated 1 million Rohingyas further down the Chittagong Hill track. So there are pressures on both ends. And finally, and this is where I want to end on the relevance to all Bangladeshis here. I'm not convinced that many of us here in the UK would be here but for that referendum. I think if we weren't in East Bengal, Pakistan then, and subsequently the liberation of 1971, if we'd been stuck in Assam, like many of our family, friends, and what have you in Cambridge, I think it would have been a much more difficult task to have got here, or found a way here, or anywhere else in the world. I'd quite happily have a discourse on anyone who suggests otherwise. But I do think we had, at least when we were in East Bengal, Pakistan, then subsequently East Pakistan, then Bangladesh, we had more access to power there than we did if we were still in Assam. And even when we had control, we were running Assam in the 40s. Just an observation over a number of generations, and I think that's worthy of celebrating. That's why I'm grateful that Peru has given me this opportunity to tell you this story. And I think it's an important one we talk about when we celebrate independence from the British Raj in 47. I'm keen for that to be, well, it is part of history, it's a forgotten bit of history. 80% of the Bangladesh community comes from Sylhet, so I think there's a good case that it should be incorporated. I would wish, however much how critical I've been of the plebiscite, I would wish at the same time they'd done that in places like Kashmir. I think we would have sorted out a mess there between India and Pakistan. I think it was quite clear which way that would have been gone, but nonetheless, that same provision in the Independence Act that was used here could easily be used there. So there are things that we, I think, need to learn and point the finger at. I don't see Kashmir being resolved in my lifetime, unfortunately. But as a result of that resolution for us, I think it was clearer for those of us Sylheti background. We had a clear idea of where we could go and were able to go. And as a result, one of those results is our presence in the UK and in other parts of the world. So I'll leave you with that thought and notes. I hope I haven't thrown you with too much historics, but I think this is the right time to have this discourse. I think we should have it once a year at this point, whenever everybody celebrates independence from the British Raj. Because, like I said, if the Pakistanis and Indians can celebrate, let's celebrate, do it in our own way, and find our own space. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Murad Bhai. So I should have introduced you. So Murad Qureshi is a former GLA member, Greater London Assembly member, mainly representing West London.
I was meant to represent the whole of London, but
yeah.
it was a very difficult show to represent the whole of London.
Cool. And now what I'll do is, so some of the issues in regards, just to give a highlight of the consequences of the referendum, some of the issues that are still being dealt with, I'll give over to Dr. Fuad Ali. So Fuad did his doctorate at King's College London looking at river erosion in Bangladesh, mainly focusing on the Brahmaputra River, and also looking at the consequences of that, including refugees trading and the migration of those refugees, which had an impact on Assam, migration to Assam, pre-referendum and post-referendum, which is still part of the debate that dominates the debate in India, but also dominates some of the debate in Bangladesh.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum, hello. Thank you, Murad, for that. I've never heard of Sylhet as the arm of Bangladesh before.
Yes.
And I think that's actually quite beautiful. Once I met a journalist in Bangladesh, another kind of geopoetry, he thought of the Ummah as a necklace around the world. I thought was also quite sweet. My talk is going to focus on immigration. I'm sorry, I don't have slides here with me, but we'll put something up on the recording. I'm really interested in this period because I find a lot of dignity and struggle and meaning in it for personal family reasons. I'm half Sylheti, half Sunamganj. It's a border town with India. We can see the Khasi Hills from our house. And my dada was involved in that period of, I guess, Muslim elite politics in Shillong. And he passed away quite early on in Pakistan. And my father was a teenager. And my late father, he spent quite a lot of his time in retirement collecting materials from Assam, and he published 2 books on it. And I really am going to enjoy this collective venture through this historical period that inshallah we will share. Because there's a lot in there to learn from. I wanted to start with the idea of Izzah, might, and Zillah, humiliation. There are things you do when you're in a state of humiliation. Say you're a persecuted migrant cultivator, and there are things that you do in a state of Izzah, where I guess majoritarian or you're a top of a Brahmin elite, right? And sometimes it's really mixed. The story of Assam is so interesting. I was late, I'm sorry, I was just reading, just get stuck. I was reading Moharali, I was reading Muhammad Hussain, I was reading Carr, I was reading so many documents about this, and it's going to take time. I think it's going to take time for all of us to assemble it, because I love it, because I very rarely positively identify with Bangladeshi political discourse. But in here we have the elements, we have language, we have race, we have colonial systems, we have the right to life, the right to plant, create access to the engines of production. We have movement, we have cosmopolitanism, and we have kind of horizons that never got fulfilled. So here's the thing, the Sylhet Referendum, there's a big story about the campaign about Ashami, and there's a big story about the line system preceding that and the struggle against the line system. The line system was an arbitrary line designed to limit access to uncultivated land from people from other parts of India. And struggle against it was all the guys who were around for the referendum. The bread and butter of their struggle would have been abolishing the line system. This has some after effects, and it's kind of part of the same entanglement. Assam comes up for me when I read a little bit of history. Bhakti Khilji had a go, didn't get very far. I think he got murdered by his cousin on the way back, right at the beginning. Remember, he takes Nadia with like 16 Arab horsemen. The rulers just ran out because they misunderstood what was going on. Then during Aurangzeb's time, he had a general called Mir Jumla, a former diamond trader, a capable general, who he sent into Bengal to pursue his brother. And when he beat off his brother tried to leave for Arakan, but they betrayed him and massacred him. But Mir Jumla was an interesting ruler of the area, and we're talking about the 1660s. In that time, somebody in Bengal had to contend with the power politics of Delhi, piracy from Arakan, and Kutch and Ahom, this northern areas, and he made an expedition up there. So there's a history of engagement, traders and warriors in Assam, and Assam has its own stuff going on. By the time the British invade, basically, because the Burmese invade. It wasn't one of their initial zones. I mean, afterwards they turned into a giant tea plantation. They constitute this Assam company, but there's an entanglement. the Assamese elite fear Muslim invasion, but as I mentioned in the beginning, there's the politics of Izzah when you are mighty, and then there's the politics of humiliation when you're not so mighty. So when xenophobia conjures these images of marauders, they need to just account for yourself and get a grip. You can see what's behind that. Right, so the entanglement of Assam is interesting. Assam is quite separate until the British, they bundle in Sylhet, some districts of Sylhet, to administer it in 1874. And from then, for about 70 odd years, there's all these debates about immigration and transfer, this, that, the other. And you get Brahmaputra Valley Muslims and Hindus, Hindus in majority, and you get Surma Valley Muslims and Hindus. Hindus in power majority, if not numerical majority. And then you have the colonial censuses, which put a whole cat amongst the pigeons by telling you how many people are around. And then you get leaderships trying to capture whoever you are. But the initial title of this seminar, when Sheikh made it, was about beyond the binary. You do get caste Hindu leaders pitching for Pakistan. There's a guy called Munda, and as Murad said, there are people who stand for Congress. And there are other interests. So Assam post 1874, there are some permanently settled Sylhet districts. There are some transition and hybrid districts like Gwalpara. There are new tribal inclusions. And remember, subduing Assam takes some time. There's lots of rebellions. In the time of the Great Indian Independence War, 1857, there is a story run in Assam, but they quashed it and they executed them. It's interesting how the mutual hatred of colonial occupation doesn't translate into a coherent political stream. In this quasi-colonial parliamentary system at the time, you had Muslim politicians, you had Hindu politicians, you had the upper valley and the lower valley, and then you had the tea interests, the Europeans, right? And at different times, folks are getting each other's votes and there's a tussle. The quality of the discourse in those times is amazing. The arguments that we can access on indigeneity, fantastic. There's one leader called Abdul Mateen Chaudhry, I don't know if you've heard of him. His descendants went to Zoroaster actually. Yeah. Right, and he's in the Assam Legislative Assembly and he's arguing that how comes if you come to this region and your ancestors were invaders, they came with Mir Jumla or the Ahom kings and destroyed the land, how comes you get all of the protections? Are not these guys who are coming or landless, are they not children of India, of Mother India? And cringe, pledged allegiance to Majesty the King. That's really interesting. You have the right to live, and the Assam politics is fascinating because who has the right to live? What's the biopolitics of it? Are the rights of future generations of perhaps lazy Assamese indigenous elites who are not using this land that is cultivable, are their needs greater than the needs of somebody who's going to starve to death? It's really, this PPL system, really, really cool. We see this here. We see it in Bangladesh with xenophobias as well. And I argue that one of the great shames of this referendum is subsequent irresponsibility of us. These solidarities that we have, that we say that we have, as soon as the political border changes, we don't have any feeling. So, okay, we should be grateful that we are Sylheti, maybe, but what about these farmers who our grandfathers were pledged to protect and work for, the rights of and struggle with? they are subject to massacre, citizen stripping. What is our responsibility for that? What happened to all the people? And here's another entanglement, going back to my central theme of immigration. There are earthquakes, famines and fevers in Assam and India, and rivers change. Momentous is a division that was next to Sylhet. It's a humongous one. It's been subdivided since. I think Ershad made it even smaller. But it's where the Brahmaputra changed course. They call it avulsion, and what we see now as the Jamuna River coming down in Bangladesh, that wasn't the dominant flow before. The quake moved that. There's been a lot of displacement in that area, and also, I'm still on the road to find out, I think their landlords were particularly nasty, that chop your heads off, things like this. Right, something we need to look into, landlordism. So we've got slavery in Assam, we've got plantation workers, slave-like conditions, and we've got the zamindar system. So there's a rainbow of oppressions there. That's why this is really important. The Assam referendum, what does it provide? What kind of protection does it provide for the victims of these oppressions? It's quite sad that colleagues who were in the same party, in the cabinet up until 1946, they perhaps had the xenophobes where they wanted them. Following independence, what is the protection of these really, really vulnerable migrants? We weren't just got rid of through the referendum, though, or we didn't protect ourselves in a limited way as you can through the referendum. From the beginning of the 20th century, there was always this debate of transfer of districts here and there, and it comes up over decades, and you can see it on the pages, and you can see the arguments. I really liked this argument of this Muslim League fellow who was, sometimes you see the Labour Party doing this as well. Look guys, the guys exploiting you are these Marwari traders. Why are you concerned about this uncultivated land on the margin that is being settled by peasant farmers? Aren't more settled areas and urban homesteads being exploited by these vampire-like Marwari traders? Why aren't you concerned about other people who've settled upland? Why is this the focus? When we see this in immigration debates, it tends to be a diversion, but it's a very effective diversion, and unfortunately we see that. There's a tussle and there's a competition for civil service jobs over language as well, and we have this in the present day. For example, because Assam was colonized late, their elites had less access to colonial systems of education. And we see this differential experience with the Hindus and the Muslims in India too. So the Assamese will say, oh, we want to reserve jobs, we want access to these jobs. So there's like a professional middle class competition there. And language was really important. Still is. Maybe we should just learn loads and not be hung up about it, because we get used and exploited and diverted by it. So already, the British East India Company in Bengal had displaced administrative Persian for Bengali, which empowered some and disempowered some. The Assamese had their own language too, and what was to be their system. And depending on which community you were, you probably didn't care a lot. Turns out that the Bengali Muslims cared for Bengali because they wanted to have Bengali in their maktabs. He just didn't really remind her about that. So some issues matter more to some communities. That's interesting. I mean, we see how language and dealing with language was really important in the build-up to Bangladesh. Right, and back to beyond the binary, a lot of what gets simplified as communal politics is actually economic inequalities due to land ownership. Never forget that. Murad, when you talked about the axe as the Muslim League symbol, I was wondering what kind of but it's probably we are the cultivators cultivating the jungles and the forests. Probably not that we're going to attack with an axe, but rhetorically that's squeeze. Yeah. A lot of people cut their teeth on this referendum. So my uncle was a youth politician then. I think he cut his teeth on it. I'm more interested in the generation before that, who were seasoned, who had seen things, and could see this real harm to the life of peasant farmers and what their proposals were. So I'll leave it at that. So earthquakes, river erosion, tussles for civil service jobs, language, deep-seated fears of domination, Islamophobia, and there's another issue about opium, which it would be a mistake to exclude. So one of the problems in Assam, as the British are coming in, before the British are coming in, is widespread opium addiction. And the British don't care. They said, no, you're going to buy our opium, because they have an opium monopoly. So that's an anxiety that which it attends to. And how did the Sylhet Referendum resolve any of these? I don't think it actually did. It's more like a filter effect.
Thanks, Fuad. So what I'm going to do is I'll just open it up for Q&A. So before I open up the Q&A, I'm going to just throw a few groupies, so to speak, to get people to start thinking about why it's important, Sylhet as 1947, and just exploring that history. So my background is I was a local authority councillor in Tower Hamlets. One of the things when I was a councillor was the level of ignorance within Tower Hamlets Council. So Tower Hamlets Council always says how proud it is of its sort of like history of migration, but the level of ignorance that they don't distinguish the subsections within that migrant community and the experiences, or they don't understand the experiences. And just to allude what Murad said, that the history of migration in the UK can be explained as a catalyst by the referendum. And just speaking to, like, through oral history, speaking to people in Tower Hamlets, a lot of the families actually came from Qureshi. So what happened was, post-referendum, they left. And so I am quite, so there's family members on my mother's side who had that experience, and there was actually land swaps. So Hindu families who were on the wrong side of the border land swapped with Muslim families who were stuck in Qureshi, and you had that exchange, so to speak. And even if you go to Qureshi today, the town itself is majority Hindu, but the surrounding area is majority Muslim. It just shows that the migration, so a lot of those Hindu families were originally in Sylhet, but they migrated to Qureshi town. And then what happened was, because of that experience of migration, those families were the first ones to take up the offer to migrate to the UK. So the families that migrated from Qureshi settled in the Biali Bazaar area, which is quite famous in terms of Tower Hamlets politics, and because a large section is settled in Tower Hamlets, but they originally, if you look at the history, came from Qureshi. And you see the same kind of history in terms of the Mirpuri community in Kashmir who came over. A large portion of that, I was speaking to someone here, where I grew up in Bedford, a large portion of the Mirpuri community were originally in what they call East Punjab, in Jalandhar. They moved to Mangla, and then Ayub Khan, I think, built the dam, and they used that money, the coupons that was given by Ayub Khan, to come to the UK. So a lot of the question is to start to explore that history, because it will help us formulate policies and understand what's actually happening in towns with the diaspora and minority communities, and it's an appeal to have data-led policies rather than prejudice-led policies. But I'll just throw it up with those Googlies to question and answers if anybody's got any questions, so to speak. So, Mahbub at the back, do you want to?
So first of all, thank you for organising and for the presentations. I think sorry, more first a comment than a question. So
Yeah.
I think thank you for the presentation. I do actually regularly go to Assam College, and the reason being is my nana is there. So we have family, our barrier is exactly back probably 3-4 miles from the border, and then my nana was literally on the other side, so hence why we kind of go with that. And I think some of the observation on the referendum and how it impacted, I think is because when I see, so my mom will like who have lived in India or they grew up in Assam, for them the journey was like they went into like Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore, and they started in those places, and they worked in those kind of places compared to say maybe our celebrities who came to the UK. And I think also it shows kind of even infrastructure and everything, like Assam is treated like the backside of India, so it's not the government invests any money compared to the celebrities, very developed compared to. I guess my question was, I think you showed me kind of the fold that Shunam going voted to be part of say, Assam, and then Karimganj voted to be.
Only Bazar voted to be in India.
Oh, sorry. Moli Bazar voted to be in India. Was there any reason why? Do we know why?
Well, I often wonder. I know real.
Because there's a Muslim majority in Wali, right? So I'm
Yeah, I mean, for example, I'm aware that in London, if you go and see the minority community in Camden, they're all from Moneybus. There's no one is. Everyone's from Moneybus. I would like to find an explanation for how that happened. But there you are, and then the makeup of what is seen as a homogeneous community is actually much more diverse than people realise. And I often wonder, and I think it's interesting. I don't think, tell me if I'm wrong, but the Moneybuzzaries in certainly Camden don't seem to fall out amongst themselves as much as they do in Tower Hamlets. And a lot of, this is where I'm going to get into difficult waters here.
I'll explain it.
Yeah, exactly. But it seems to be a lot of village politics in Tower Hamlets, which I've never understood, and neither did my dad when he was around. He's what he used to say, it's all village politics, you're not going to understand it. And he was thankful he was just a humble councillor in the city of Westminster. But yeah, I just think, we have the family experiences, and I think we should bring them out. I mean, my Nunnabury, we have family in Karimganj. Actually, one of the things we do is every so often we will marry someone on the other side of the border to help those movements. It's practice. I mean, we've had that quite a few occasions. My Sutamama wedding was essentially a mechanism to help the family members on the wrong side of the border to come over if need be. And they were caught up in an enclave as well situation, which is another thing we shouldn't forget. And whilst I've got the floor, I just want to respond. There were other issues around the referendum. There's no doubt, but it wasn't posed in that way. It was only posed around whether you want to be in East Bengal or not. No different to the Brexit referendum. We had a whole host of other issues raised and things like this, freedom movement and this, that, and the other. But I mean, the Brits, it came down to sovereignty and whether, supposed sovereignty over their lives and what have you. Not that I was supporting it. And I think that's what happens in referendums. It's a kind of binary choice. Well, there will always be several issues around. But nonetheless, at the moment that you go in to the balance and put your cross against it, that's what's going to be influence. That's the influence you're going to have on that issue. And as I've suggested, I think that's what did happen at the time. I think the long run implication was that someone like me is sitting here at all. I don't think if I was on the Indian side, I would be here at all. But whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I've not suggested that. Just that that's just a reality. But I would welcome a discourse with people from Cambridge and how they feel about it. I mean, do they still moan? Do they moan at all? The fact that we actually voted deputies, maybe would rather be there than in India. And are the Indians even receptive to that argument? Because at that point in time, as shown, and these figures are lying here in the UK, they're not necessarily out there. All I did was go down the road from where I am to the British Library and got the figures. So I would be intrigued to know if there are people in Cambridge who would rather be effectively now in Bangladesh rather than in India. Or whether they think, well, that's it, work done, we've moved on. And let's drop it as we have done anyway.
One of the things that I encourage is whenever I go over there, I just try to do my own history, exploring, etc. So one of the issues in regards to the referendum, when I spoke to people who were at that time living there, they've all passed away now, was the issue of land ownership. And I can't emphasize how big that issue was. So what we had in Bengal was something called the permanent settlement, brought in by, I think, Warren Hastings. And it's a bit like what they did in Ireland, what they basically gave land ownership to a religious minority. So in Ireland, it was majority Catholic. They gave the land ownership to Protestant landlords who effectively run these plantations. You had the similar, so it's ironic that Warren Hastings later on became, or Cornwallis became the Governor General of Ireland as well. So you had the same pattern established in Bengal, where they established land ownership, where the majority of the tenant farmers were Muslims and the landlords were Hindus. And so the communal element had actually a class element to it. So when I spoke to family members, they basically saw it as economic justice, literally in terms of 200 years of oppression under the Permanent Settlement Act. And the day after the referendum result was announced, it was basically emancipation from an oppressive system. And you saw the land ownership in Sylhet change hands. And from once people have access to capital, then they can establish schools, they could establish hospitals, clinics, they could actually migrate as well abroad. So once you have access to land, then you've got access to mortgage that land to pay for the ticket or the ship passage to come to the UK. So that's something that needs to be explored. Even if you go to Sylhet, if you look at some of the district names, sub-districts, they have sort of like Hindu names to it, indicating that the land, that these were actual estates. So, for example, Jagannathpur or Balaganj or Vishnath, these are not. So when you speak to people, why are these names, why are these districts, sub-districts named that? Because they're the daughters of a landlord, etc., just to indicate how big the estates were. I don't know how true that is your history that needs to be explored. So that's something that we need to look at. That it's not just a communal element, but there's a whole socio-economic struggle there, and that still informs debates both in Bangladesh and basically in India as well. That struggle of the land and economic justice that sometimes takes a communal flavour to it. But I'll encourage everyone to go, whenever you go, just ask people. And a good place to start is land ownership, and just trace that land ownership.
There was some, before we started talking, we were talking about land disputes and so that, and I was reading proceedings of the legislature, and you can see some familiar traits in the migrants in Assam, on the marginal lands, where they would be seeking land and they would pay really good money money for the land. And middlemen or owners of the land would say, yeah, this land is yours, but they wouldn't do any paperwork. And then they would complain to the authorities of these guys are swamping us. And then here's another one, and this one really makes me laugh. So, and let's use the word settlers for another one. You know, this isn't Zionism. So, you had old settlers screwing over new settlers as well, and that's just it's perfect. You know, it's just, there's a lot that doesn't change, but I think there's a lot of responsibility that a border between Sunamganj and this area seems to have fizzled away in our brains as we, the politics of that region has hardly any relationship with Assam and people struggling for citizenship and survival there. So often people in the whole resolution Muslim zones, be it Bangladesh or Pakistan, say, oh, I'm so glad that we ended up not in India. And that's not really what somebody being oppressed over the border, it's kind of dustbin politics, you know?
Yeah, fire away.
Yeah, my name is Sylhet, by the way. Well, thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I suppose my interest in this is more on the macro level. It's not the micro stuff. You're talking about it's all good and fascinating. But I think when it comes to 47, I think the Bangladeshis or the Bengalis are not so interested as Pakistan, and that's my impression. You may disagree. And I'm just curious to know why that is the case. I mean, I have kind of some understanding why, but it just feels that we're not really so bothered by the 47 partition stuff. But I think that we should be. I think we should be equally bothered like the other two communities, put it that way. I mean, it would be nice if the thing, just to go back to the short it would be nice that if we didn't have those hard borders, we had another kind of setup where this situation didn't exist, that's just about it. But just thought, what is your thought on this thing? And is it really worth us? I mean, my personal take is, we should. Yeah. And I think this whole 71 thing is just, for me, I don't want to offend anybody, but it's just a nonsense, all right? And I think it's a diversion, and the whole focus as if the universe started in 71, it's nonsense as far as I'm concerned, because I think our history is obviously much beyond. I think we touched on the history beyond 71, 47 and so forth. And I think it's important that we connect the present generation to all of that history. I think it's important that we bring that history to life. I mean, I'm surprised, I'm not surprised really, I didn't have any expectation, but I did expect a little bit more people to turn up, maybe people on holidays, I don't know. But I think it's good that you brought this up. I knew very little about that particular referendum before I saw your thing. I didn't know, I had heard about it, I didn't really focus on it much. But this issue does say that the Bengalis also had an important event in 47. So we should maybe commemorate. I don't know if celebrate is the right word, but some thoughts.
Well, look, the immediate response is actually, I think there is a reason, why it doesn't get what happens. Look, as I said earlier, if 47, if we hadn't had independence from the British Raj, liberation of Bangladesh in 71 wouldn't happen. A lot would follow through.
Yeah.
So we should make that connection. And I think the reason why it gets overlooked is very clear to me. This is what normally happens in my household on 15th of August. We're commemorating the death of one of them, Shepherd Jew. That's overtaken the kind of historical relevance of that date. I know the 15th next Tuesday. Sunday 34th, and it's next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, the Bangladesh High Commission will do events and things like this. So that overshadows things. There's no doubt about it. But I'm trying to make a space, and this is, a family that will mourn the passing of Whitechapel. I think we've got to also make space for what happened in 47, on the 14th and 15th of August. I think that's part of the story. And within that story is this referendum, and we shouldn't forget it. I'm glad you can see the logic of it. And more widely, I think we should balance. There was the comparison with Ireland was quite interesting. The British cocked up 3 partitions. Let me be frank. The first was the Irish partition in the 20s, then the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 47, and the other one we should forget, they cocked it up in Hason.
I'm not sure I agree with the term cocked up, but that's a different thing.
Yeah, okay. Well, no, I think there was a particular, I mentioned Mountbatten very clearly. He was involved in all 3 of them. He was involved in all 3 of them. There was no doubt a dominant ideology amongst British bureaucrats at that whole time to look at things in not an ethno or regional terms, but in religious terms. I'm not sure how useful that was in the long run. We had a colleague here, he's left now, before the meeting was suggested, well, maybe it would be better if we were all in the Federation in 47. Who knows, yes. But today that's not possible. We've got 70 years of history. So yeah, we should. I think there is still something to level against the Brits, even though I'm one now. And also, I concur. I think space should be made. But I think the reason, my explanation of why there isn't, looking back at 47, the Bangladesh is here, or in Dhaka. Tell me if I'm wrong. But when I was in Dhaka at that time, no, it doesn't really register. And yet, if you think about it, Bengal suffered the most under the British rule, without any doubt, economically or whatever level. Because first 100 years of the British Raj was the East, not the British Raj, the East, it was direct control of the East Indian Company.
And was it not the richest province when?
Yeah, exactly. So we went from top dog to bottom dog. In the life of the British Raj. So yeah, I do think that shouldn't be forgotten in that context. The other reason maybe the Sylhet story I think maybe not raised as much in 47 context is actually we had a lot less communal violence in Sylhet. I think in Punjab, that's crazy things. When in the last few years, you've heard stories about how Sikh men killed their wives and daughters and sisters, so they weren't taken by Muslim men. And so that was going to happen anyway. We didn't have craziness like that, thank goodness.
And I think that's probably part of the explanation.
Yeah.
I think, if I remember correctly, the Bangladesh saw it as an opportunity as well, from an economic perspective, the partition thing. So that's probably part of the explanation, but yeah, sorry.
But there is a story within there were common lines in Kolkata, Noahani, but there wasn't any in Sylhet. I think this referendum helped because it settled the issues about, however badly it was administered, as I pointed out, people, a judgment call was made. I've highlighted how some politically significant a narrative that using the acts as a symbol to attack Congress. It sounded very violent, but actually, it didn't turn out violent afterwards. There was a more pragmatic response. But I haven't heard of the common violence in Sylhet in comparison to Noahani and Kolkata. That's what I'm saying. It's all relative, of course. I'm not saying there wasn't, but it's all relative to that time. And I think, I think let's be grateful for some small mercies. And I think having this rushed, dramatic referendum did help deal with those kind of issues, and as a result, because I will go in October to commemorate my dad, his passing, and and when we do that without shindy and what have you, but it's in the middle of Diwali, there's loads of lights and things like this. I've got no problems with that. And neither have my relatives down there. That's in the middle of Sylhet town. You know, we've still got a Hindu population there, and let's make sure they're still there. It's like, you know, in a country that's becoming Muslim. So I think those are the realities I see. I think they do come from earlier events and how they were dealt with. And you know, I know, Paru, you make efforts on that front here in the UK, and I know the last event. I think that's very important. They're very critical for the understanding between, I suppose, the two different religious communities. When actually the differences aren't very much at all.
No, definitely. I think I'm going to be slightly critical here. I think one of the things I've discovered is there isn't that space for critical history in Bangladesh, but for various political reasons. So the focus is on 1971, and that does drown out other history or historical research of that. And I think that's a role that we can play in the UK, in London, where the East India Company was just around the corner. We could literally walk from here to where the headquarters or where Lloyd's of London is. You've got the archives, British Library, etc. There is a policy argument for Tower Hamlets Council to celebrate South Asian heritage of having the largest South Asian population in all the English boroughs. Creating that space, you know, we do have an archive in Tower Hamlets in Bangkok where the council can pass a resolution asking for the archive to collate historical records around, say, 1947, etc., in particular focus on Sylhet, but other parts of Bengal, and basically produce that every year. So I think we can kickstart this much needed work in terms of history. And I say why it's needed is because when we don't know our history, that's when the demagogues come in to polarize communities. And I'm seeing it here in Tower Hamlets. And that's, for me, one of the personal reasons is to explore this history. Because what's happened recently since Brexit is we've had large migrations into Tower Hamlets within the Bangladeshi community, but not from the Sylhet region. And what I've noticed after the election is various political figures whipping up divisions and prejudice between those two sections. And I think once people realise history and how complicated it is, and how complex and nuanced, it's much more difficult for demagogues or people for political reasons to whip up these prejudices. So that's something that we can kickstart here, and that's what the impetus of kickstarting is, to take it to the council and say, look, this is needed, let's do this, because there is a demand for it as well. And it's something also we could do links to groups in Bangladesh, in Sylhet as well. And one of the disheartening things for me whenever I visit Sylhet is to see a piece of history being destroyed. So I just want to give two family anecdotes. Like, for example, my village where I come from, it was founded about 700 years ago. So there was a really nice mosque, and they demolished it. They got a new structure there, because and I was the only person arguing against it. And they said, oh, we need a car park. So you demolished a really ornate architecture just for a car park. And then recently, last year when I went in January, near Ettinggonj, just out of Sylhet, there's an old mobile road that goes from Ettinggonj to Dahabokin, to the Kushiara River. So it joins the Shulma River to the Kushiara River. And there was these really old mobile bridges, and they were destroying them. So I was the only guy, being a typical Englishman, having an argument with the locals, saying, look, why are you destroying the bridge? And they go, oh, we want a brand new bridge, what's your problem? And, you know, I had an argument with my uncle. And then half an hour later, I think you've got a point there. You should have kept the bridge. But it's too late. So you've had 200 years of history just completely been smashed away, and it's never going to come back. And that road is very important to talk about the families that settled in that area, because all the families settled from all over India into the Dahadokin region based on that mobile road. So it's something that we can do in the UK, is to help communities and groups in Sylhet, in Bangladesh, to preserve that history. So the history is still there, but I think we need to help preserve it, and that's something we can do.
Sorry, can I just say, sorry, I want to but I think it's important to realise the value in doing this, not just for the people over there, but for the fourth, third generation Bengali, users here, because a lot of them are disconnected, so, when you're uprooted, because yes, you can identify as British and English and Whitechapel and whatever, right? But if you're disconnected from your heritage, then you lack your personality. I'm sure you're not.
No, 100%.
But what I'm saying is this thing is very slow in like if this bit of history that we talked about today. What percentage of people of our background know about this and are bothered about it, or see the value in incorporating that in their personality? Other communities, they do that, and therefore this empowers them, because you have this confidence about you when you know who you are. And I think when you're uprooted from that, when you want to identify as an Englishman, when you assimilate, I'd like to differentiate between assimilation and integration here, right? When you assimilate and you think you're an Englishman, and you don't want a connection with your history, then that personality is a weak personality, a personality which lacks confidence about themselves, right? And so that's why these things, for me, it's important to bring this out and to have a mass education, so that people feel, maybe empowered.
100%. So I just want to answer that from a public policy point of view. Hamlets have the largest child poverty rates in all of, say, Western Europe. The majority of that is concentrated in the Bangladeshi community. It has much worse poverty rates relative poverty rates than Bangladesh. That's how banana republic we are when it comes to certain facts and figures in Hamlet. So like enrichment, providing social capital to individuals is a root cause of poverty. So poverty is not just a physical state of mind, it's a mental state of mind as well. And it is a long journey. So, with the community language service, they abolished it. I personally took a stand, got suspended, but the community language service is back again as an anti-poverty tool. So same thing with history as well. And that's why I always make the case. When I was a counsellor, there was this narrative that Bangladeshis just fell from the heaven in 1978, that before that they were never there. And I always point out that Bangladeshis were here in the East End for 400 years. It's just you guys didn't notice it because you didn't need their votes. When you needed the votes, then all of a sudden you're recording the history, the squatter movement, the anti-racism, but you're not recording the history where it's been for 400 years. So there's a book that's published in 1785 by Ihtishamuddin about his travels in 1766 here in the East End. So that's something that we need to challenge, and that's what this is about. Everything is the first step, and let's go on this journey. Because one of the action points from this is we want to take the proposal to Town Hamlets Council, saying, look, here's a proof of concept. It works. The demand, it needs to be done. Other London boroughs are doing it. You have the largest South Asian population in all of England. It's a bit weird that you're not doing it. Fuad, just...
Yeah. There's a reason why the political selfhood of the Bangladeshis is presented the way it is. No one's forcing you or me to subscribe to that. We're free to write and research and speak how we choose here. But the politics of memory of partition in the British establishment might be something that's of utility to some people. The politics of I'm Bangladeshi. This is my political self and struggle, and it is hundreds of years towards the direction of justice. I don't care about figures. I care about principles.
That's not the story that's
Going to get much traction in our media culture, which is quite base, right? In this culture or the rest. But I'm sure Safe is going to write some kids' books on it.
Fuad was settled by the Brahmaputra and the Upper Valley. Yeah, it'll be wicked.
There can be a lot done there, but if you speak to postgraduate students, researchers from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, it's probably you'll have a much more interesting time speaking to the Indian, and then personally I might have interest in
Landform politics of Pakistani.
but on Bangladesh it's younger. You could say the Bengali Muslim was much more economically and intellectually repressed under colonization. Right? So the 71 thing is the most important thing, and there's no room for anything else. However, what's so liberating about it is that if you go to 1947, a lot of the stuff that generated 71 hasn't even happened yet. It's a bit more, there's fewer people with guns in the game, you know? And then what's really great about, and I don't think 1947 is a liberation. I really like Arun Ghosh, the clarinet player's Red Fort. Apparently in India, after independence, they had a magnificent concert in the Red Fort. That's such a beautiful moment of triumph. Let's just appreciate that. That's quite well curated. I think 1857 is much more interesting for us. So every time August 15th comes around, Indians feel like they're represented by this communal violence image that everybody gives on the BBC. Do I want to be part of that? Here's the Bangladesh story. I don't know. I want to say actually every Ramadan on the 27th, when we celebrate, the revelation of the Quran, Laylatul Qadr, that's the 14th, 15th of August 1947. That's just. So I bypassed the assassination of Mujib. I bypassed all of that. So you can remember things, and I think we who truly believe in social and spiritual justice, in the horizontal and the vertical, we do not need these national instruments of memory forcing. If you go to Bangladesh on Valentine's Day, you get more people in the streets celebrating this base. I don't understand, right? That's not something we should compete for with loud voices. So
that is the point. So 47, just to come back to that. So 47 wasn't really a liberation as such. From a
They're waypoints, right? They're waypoints.
Yeah, a seemingly political kind of liberation, but really intellectually, economically, it wasn't, right? So Valentine's Day, I think, also reinforces that, from a mentality perspective, we haven't really liberated, have we?
But can I? I think mentality does play a part. I'm just struck by Amartya Sen's analysis that we want multiple identities and we move between them. Before I walked into this room, I was supporting English women's team in the World Cup. As soon as I walked into this room, I reverted to being a, dare I say, a Bengali nationalist or whatever. My family, a political thing. We move between them very easily, and I think we do that as well during a political calendar. 16th of December, what happens then? We celebrate the liberation of Bangladesh. 27th of March is another date that we celebrate, 1971. We nearly celebrate, we also commiserate we lost 2 uncles. And I just asked me to do a similar thing 47. So I think it was a prelude to what happened in 71. You know, all you have to do is listen to Sheikh Mujib's speech of March, the 7th of March. It's basically 23, 24 years of angst. If you read books like my dad wrote and Sylhet Referendum, they knew almost instantly what a mistake it was. The difficulties they were going to face within Pakistan. As soon as Jinnah went to Dhaka and said in English, the state man was going to be altered. And they all knew he couldn't speak a bloody word of Urdu. You know, that was the irony. So I think it is important that we do this. We also got to remember the British narrative is changing. For the last 20 years, I'd say it was the Attenborough interpretation of partition. I mean, the Nehru's, Gandhi's, and been on the sidelines of that and what have you. The gentleman's agreement 47 trying to do as well as they could, but had to walk away from it. Well, we know that wasn't the case at all. But and it's only more recent we're getting that knocked away at. But my angst about that is only come from a particular perspective, from Punjab and what have you. I think there's a particular perspective, not only Bengal, but from Sylhetis. And I also do think we should ask for space when that discourse comes up. I don't think that's too much at all. If the Pakistanis and the Indians can get about it, I can start from the point which hopefully will keep all Bengalis together. So we actually suffer more than British than anyone else. So don't think we weren't at the forefront of this. The campaigns for the British to quit or what have you. We were clearly. So yeah, I think you can occupy both those spaces. And people are sophisticated enough to wear different hats at different points of time, literally within the same day, but certainly within the calendar year. And I just think on the 14th and 15th of August, yes, like I said, when I was at the City Hall as a London Body Assembly, I found it intriguing. I would get invites from the Pakistanis and the Indians that come along, and I go along. I just didn't see the same. And I've given you a partial explanation, but we need to be playing that, and this is the way to do it. And I think it's important. I don't want, I don't think there's a need to have someone to do a PhD in this or further research. I think it's pretty straightforward to get what you need out there. It's all here in London, and we should have confidence of our own, our family experiences to be able to put these perspectives over. That's what I'm up to. I'm glad I've been given this opportunity. I just hope we can hopefully do this annually, of some sorts, and build on it. I'm sure, if you go out there, you'll hear other stories. I grew up with all these stories, but I realised when I got older, I don't think everyone's heard them. I think it was a particular generation of men that I was exposed to. I'd heard the stories from my dad about them running Assam, and then I heard about what actually happened in 47. But their focus isn't the British leaving, it's always been this. Funny enough, for Sylheti families in Sylhet town, that was the focus, clearly, and I can see how that was. But it was also a prelude to other things, and they did realise, they were getting into a much more difficult situation in some ways. And I may have given a more rosy picture of that, but let's do this more regularly, not annually. I would suggest at the time of independence from the British Raj, and hopefully we can draw people to that way of thinking, including public authorities, town hamlets, and see the merit of it. I think 71 is another small thing I did on the 50th anniversary was actually London played a significant role in 1970. I think that there was a reason why, when Sheikh Mujib was released, where did he come to? He didn't go straight to Dhaka, he came to London and put up with challenges. to the credit of the British government at the time, they weren't taken in by what, they weren't taken in the position that the Americans were. And that was down to political pressure here amongst Bengalis within the Pakistan community. No doubt about it. But that's another story that we could tell, and I think we've got to make sure we incorporate these when these things are. Pakistan don't want to discuss 75. Do they? Let's face it. And yet they lost more than half the country, the majority of the country.
I think you find a lot of Pakistanis, they didn't really know the details.
Yeah.
I saw Imran Khan recently. And then because of it, a lot of people did dig into it and they were surprised that this was
exactly.
this
They're completely, I mean, England actually. But actually, if there was one democratic election they should have supported, it was that one. It was clear. And that, it was a fair and free election to all intents and purposes. No one, all the readers I've done, have never suggested otherwise. And to the credit, would you believe, of the Pak Army. What was outrageous was the Pak Army's involved. And they've had that ever since. Well, we've had the Bangladesh Army do their deeds in the 70s and 80s, but by and large, it's sitting in the barracks. They haven't got that position. But yeah, I think the important thing is that we have got a story to say. We make space for ourselves, amongst ourselves, then go into these other arenas and say, well, actually, there's a different take. And I think the story of 47 will evolve. As I've said, it's gone from this kind of Attenborough story based on the Gandhi film to a more critical one. And I think as that critical view develops, we should come in and make our contribution and emphasise different things that haven't been picked up. And hopefully, not only authorities like Tahammad, but others will pick up on it. We have got the family members of all these events. There's no doubt about it. My family has, everyone has, is my view. You just got to tap into it. Where it's recorded and recollecting something recorded it in all the various ways that are possible.
Cool. I'm going to bring things to an end, but just to let you, everyone know that one of the things we've been discussing is to actually take this to town.